I'm going to go ahead and get started then. For all of you here, I assume that you are aware that you are here for the prop design talk. Prop design, from what I have seen, is one of the most foundational concept art things you'll ever see or do. And a lot of it can go relatively unnoticed, which means people don't often think about how important it is. A little bit about me. I'm not going to read everything to you, but I am currently working on my Master of Fine Arts in concept art. I will graduate in the spring, which is part of why I haven't been around very much lately. I apologize. My thesis has taken priority. I already have a Master of Arts in Visual Development for film and games. Prior to that, I have a Bachelor of Arts in English and a Master of Library Science. Over in my skill set, you'll see figure drawing, character design, prop design, and creature design. These are all aspects of concept art that I have studied through school and on my own that contribute to having the appropriate skills for doing concept art. Because concept art is a little different than illustration or fine art, which I can talk about in a little bit. Next. Just so everybody has kind of the same foundation for prop design, props can include organic and inorganic subjects. So if you're asked, hey, can you draw some mushrooms? Those are still part of props. If you are asked to draw, I don't know, a stone ruin, that is props bordering on environment, but a lot of times the lines between things get a little bit muddy because sometimes props are what make an environment. Props can include naturally occurring, created, or manufactured subjects. So depending on what your claim is, you could be asked to provide just like a rock or some firewood stacked up or even a tool that shows manufacture marks. And we'll get into what things show a little bit later. Props can include subjects that are used, that you physically interact with, or that someone uses, or that just remain static and are part of the scene in which they exist. I'm sure many of you have seen that referred to as clutter. Being a clutter artist is actually pretty important because a lot of times those props that give a sense of the environment's life are what make it believable. Props can include subjects that are meant to stand out or that you're not really meant to notice, but which exist to help sell the idea of the environment in which you find yourself. Go ahead and skip. These are a couple of claims that I did for Morrowind. The two on the right are sea urchins and sea sponges. And then the left is an Azura statue that I did that I didn't even get to finish all of the orthographics before the 3D artist completed it. So that was really cool to see happen very quickly. But in order to make it easier on everyone, I provided options for plinths, options for poses, options for texture, color, material, and then for my own sake, I used Daz Studio and Mudbox to put together a rough figure and a pillar, which I didn't include here because it didn't fit, and use that as a base to start working over. So I used those 3D tools to give me something to work in 2D over so that I could communicate the idea for the 3D artist. The sea sponges and sea urchins have no 3D elements to them, but I studied thousands of pages on Google image results of sea flora and fauna and started combining some of those ideas with terrestrial plants and stuff. You can see very much in a couple of them a carnivorous plant design worked into things. Several of them have been combined with different variety of cacti just to try to add something different and try to make them look familiar but interesting. Next. This is a reference sheet that I put together for an Atmore claim that I did for the Cane of the Woodland Man. I looked at all kinds of different styles of canes, staves, branches, anything vaguely long. And I went through, and obviously I looked up the owner of the cane, you see here, proportion to a human, which made me think about the size that this cane would need to ultimately be, which would be staff size. Next, you can see here the actual claim. It doesn't have, it has a better description than some things that I have had to work from, but the things that I latched onto were gnarly wood and welkin. And I jumped from there into doing just weird twisted wood shapes and adding crystals or in some places bone just to see what fit, what worked. There were 4 that were preferred and 1 that was a clear favorite, so that is the one I went up. And when I submitted that, because people need to have the information to implement it and to start modeling it, they need to know the size. So I have a human silhouette next to a silhouette of the staff, and that is based on placing a human spine, which is the bulk of the staff, next to a human and extrapolating from there a decent size, because it may be staff size to a human, but it is just a walking cane to its original owner. So it needed to have an air of support and normalcy while also still very clearly being a rare item. And I have what we call callouts here to show the materials. And here I have a flat palette for people to study colors from when they get to the point of wanting to texture and material it. Next. This is where concept art gets huge. Personally, I prefer character concept art. Props are something I've discovered that I really, really enjoy, but part of that is vehicle design, and I don't like doing vehicle design. I don't like doing technical design. I don't like machines. I don't like hard surfaces. I'm very much attached to organic things because they have wiggle room. They don't have to be as precise. That said, you still got to be able to do things you don't really enjoy doing. So I had to do construction and military vehicle studies for a class. I had to come up with a cyber motorcycle design. I had to come up with this horse cart is a prop for my thesis. And I have the thumbnails here to show a minimum of 8 iterations with a cleaned up version and then a version that is as rendered out as it's going to be with the size comparison to a horse and human. Because that's all information that an artist down the pipeline is going to need. Next. These are some older versions of props, some of which I have revisited and some of which I haven't had a call to go back to. The upper left is an item that is fairly center in my thesis. It's an amulet. The center top is basically just experimenting with ways to portray wood. The right top is a compilation of environment, organic and inorganic props for a Little Red Riding Hood story that I had to assemble for my classes. Lower left is a pillar from my thesis. The center and the one on the right are a bunch of sort of nautical themed leading, because they were started as concepts for a card game that never came to fruition because of COVID. Next. These are some of my thesis props. Some of them are recycled designs that I came across when I was doing those previous prop designs, but you can see that for the staves at the top, I did the interesting portions first so that people could see more or less the style of each staff. And then my professor selected the one with the green globe. And originally it just had a straight handle, but having the additional flourishes and points of interest kind of helped move the eye through it. So that was even in itself iterated after it was chosen. And you've got rough thumbnails of various levels. Like, honestly, some of these are a little too detailed for good thumbnails. But part of that is that I did the rough thumbnails and then worked directly on top of them to do any kind of inking. There's like this coin over here. The flat line-like art is extremely cleaned up and minimized because it was used to actually produce this coin. And then the colored version was to show a sort of warm gold color. Not true gold, but brass, hence the redder areas. And just to show that it has dimension, things carved in and things that stick out as a result. This ink bottle is from the cover of the lecture. I have a version of it standing and then a version of it reflecting and refracting light from the scene in my thesis. A lot of times when you have an item like this, it's good to show, here is what it looks like just by itself, and then here's what it looks like as part of its environment, or here's what it looks like in a separate state. So like over here, these two lanterns, right? I have one just as it is, and then one showing what it looks like illuminated. I should do a collapsed version of this spyglass. I just haven't gotten around to it. And then a really important thing to remember when you are coming up with ideas for any item that you need, try to vary them as much as possible. Get a huge variety of shapes and sizes, and don't throw them away. Like, just because you don't use them does not mean you should ever get rid of them, because you can come back to them years later and you can repurpose them, which is what I did with my compass, spyglass, lantern, and amulet. Next. This is kind of an extension of the point that I made with the Azura statue. It's very helpful to your art director to give them essentially a set of options that they can choose and put together something however they want. So for both this rapier and this court sword, I have blades, guards, grips, and pommels. and was able to show my professor, here's what I've got, and he was able to go this, 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 and this, and put together a sword. In general, it is helpful for anyone down the pipeline to understand how what you're handing to them, how it works, how it's put together. So I have this pulled apart version of a sword with the blade, grip, pommel, and then a pommel nut, and then the guard above them, showing how everything kind of fits into itself and locks into place. And then I've got a diagram showing the parts of a sword, and then beneath that, I have diagrams showing how to hold this particular type of grip. In addition, I put in 3 different options for belt frogs, from which the sword can hang. And then I also showed how that fits onto the character's armor with a blown up version of the sword actually inserted. And then, because I enjoy painting props a lot, I came over and I did a higher quality rendering of the selected court sword that was assembled, and have been going in and trying to show materials. I don't know that you can probably see very well through the presentation, but even the sheath has some material indicators where I have put leather stamping in. And those are the kind of details that you just eventually you learn to think about. But when you're first starting, it may not ever cross your mind. Next. This is just kind of a demonstration of how you can design very disparate looking things, but when you put them all together, you can see that they belong together. This was basically an experiment in some generic steampunk looking pieces and how they might fit together, how their sizing might be, what the materials might look like stacked up, and then some vehicle designs for various classes within the world. So a horse-drawn carriage, a flying carriage, and then an entire train that can fly, that are all just put together to kind of build an idea of a world. And then from here, I would get feedback on yes, this, no, this, put this together, change this. One of the pieces of feedback I was given on the hot air balloon carriage was to change the shape a little bit so that it doesn't look quite so much like an apple. And I was like, yeah, I didn't even see that while I was working. So sometimes it's super simple things, you just don't see them, which is why it's good to have peers you trust and teachers you trust that you can be like, hey, what do you think? And get honest feedback. Next. When you're doing concept art, it is important to know what is expected for you to be turning in. Some people want nothing more than this upper left corner. These are scribbles, they have labels. Nothing is super clear, but it is a jumping off point. This little diamond shaped hexagon thing is a prop for a friend's thesis who she was struggling with the shape, so she sent it to me and I just played around with flipping the edge pieces and seeing what that changed or how it changed things, and that little detail was enough for her to feel comfortable with what she had and then keep going. Sometimes people want a clean line drawing. They don't want to see your thumbnails. They don't want to see your sketches. They don't want to see any preliminary work. They just want a clean presentation. Sometimes people want a couple of different options, but none of them completely rendered. They just want to be able to be like, okay, yeah, I really like the skull in the upper right-hand corner, really like the 3 skulls stacked up, we can use those. And from there, you would take them forward and you would render them out as much as you're told. Some people want fully realized props that have material indicators that show something about a story. For this one, you can see there's blood soaked into the parchment. You can see that it was a thick enough parchment that the use of a pen carved into the parchment. You can see that it's been roughly handled by all the tears. And sometimes people want you to produce one finished looking idea, which is where this monkey head bell pull came from. I was doing commissions for a tabletop game that I'm in, and this was one of the items, and she didn't need multiple iterations of it. She just needed something that would communicate how creepy it was in that instant at a glance. Because regardless of what you've created, you're not always going to visually engage an audience for an extensive look, so you need to be able to communicate as much impactful information as quickly as possible. Next. Some of these might look familiar, some of them may not. A lot of times people ask, how do I get better at designing anything? And the answer is always studies. Do studies. Studies of things you may not even think you need to study. I've got skeletal structure, muscular structure. I've got both extended and bent limbs. I've got hands. I've got feet. And then I've got facial muscles in profile, all of which were done for one of my courses, but which are able to inform my design process in other materials, which I'll show in a little bit. And one thing that I really want to try to drive home for people is that you don't have to go looking for like old masters to do studies. You don't have to go looking for something fancy or something highbrow. This is literally over here on the left. This is a picture of my husband wearing his fencing glove. That's it. We just picked up something from around the house and I drew it. The 3-point perspective was just a table, 2 books, and a lamp. But it works because it was putting all of them into the same perspective. You don't have to get fancy. You just have to do as much as you can. Next. A lot of my studies are of skeletal structure and bone because osteology is a secondary hobby of mine. So I'm able to go to an osteological museum and do studies from their specimens. But that familiarity has informed some of my digital work. Like in the left is a wolf skull that has been cracked, has been aged, and has been stained with moss. All of which I wouldn't have been able to paint or sell the idea of if I didn't have a solid foundation of the actual skull. Not everyone is in a position to do so. I personally purchased from a legal and ethical source. I purchased a gray wolf skull to do these studies from. I can't speak for every artist ever, but a lot of them that I know tend to collect something. And sometimes the things we collect may seem completely useless to everyone but us, but you can always do studies. You can always work to understand how the things you've collected fit together, how they're made, how they look on different surfaces. And you can put that towards your art. Next. When I say do studies, I don't just mean do studies of props. I do mean do studies of everything. Animal studies are great because if you understand how materials like feathers fit an animal, when you go to employ them in your actual designs, you'll have a better understanding of how they're attached, how they move, how they go together. And that can be really helpful in selling the believability of a design. Fortunately, when it comes to doing studies, I said earlier with designs, with vehicle designs, I don't like doing vehicles. While I like doing insects even less, I am actually a pretty severe arachnophobe. So I had just the darndest time doing the right drawing, but glad that I did, because the making me think about how those legs fit together, how they move, how everything is connected has been helpful in influencing other designs. Thinking about like how beetles' wings open and close, how they fold together, how they're concealed. That can be really helpful if you're thinking about like armor design. Because when you're designing armor, your best bet is to look at something that already has armor. And a lot of times insects get glossed over because people think that will look hokey, but you have to understand that you don't necessarily need to copy the insect itself, take those ideas from it. So you can have like movable pauldrons, and you can have a cloak fastened under them, the same way that this wing connects to the shell. It just takes a little bit of creativity to see how you can adapt things. And concept art is very much centered on adapting things to fit the needs that you've been presented with. Next. The other thing that I highly recommend, especially if you want to be a digital artist, is material studies like this. Every single one of these started as this cube. And I had to put together rusted metal, weathered stone, marble, glass, ice, grass, dirt, sand, cheese, meat, amber, goo, clay, a Lego. And when you have to sit and think about what this cutaway chunk of a material looks like, it really forces you to observe the material you're portraying in a way that will help inform the people down the pipeline so that they know what they should be looking at, so that like, you know, you don't hand them, here's an orange and it's a perfectly smooth orange ball. It's got the pitting in its peel, it's got faults, it has, you know, like water droplets sitting on it. Those are all the kinds of things that you come to consider through doing material studies like this. The giant emerald started off as this cube, but I looked up and studied so many different faceted gemstone charts, and I worked as a jeweler's apprentice for a while, so I was able to implement that knowledge as well. And I think it's a passable emerald, but I would like to readdress it because I think I can do better now. And that's a thing you will find as you improve as an artist. You'll look back at things you did before and you'll be like, I can do that better now. In which case you absolutely should. Redoing your own work helps you see how you've grown and helps you understand how your process has changed. A little less impressive than a faceted gemstone. On the right here, I have fur, feathers, frog patterns, and snake scales that were all samples for a 2D platformer that I worked on part of my degree for the various enemy creatures. Next. Something that's very fun to do that I had never thought to do until semester. Do studies of just some basic items around your house, and then draw them as if they existed in different IPs. So we were given Blade Runner 2049. I chose BioShock rather than going with Breath of the Wild because I'm not as familiar with that. And H.R. Giger Alien IP and just went crazy trying to figure out how my normal stuff around my house would look in each style, which involved a lot of research, but which is a fun challenge because it makes you think about what is the defining visual hallmark of each of these styles. So for Blade Runner, it very much was this feels what what we sometimes call old new, where it feels like, yes, this is future technology, but it's like clearly built out of like pieces of computer that are like 30 years old, or like you may have a holographic lamp, but the post is literally just a rusty pipe. And that sort of fits into the aesthetic of that setting. Bioshock was easy because it was all Art Deco. And then having to think about what makes the aesthetic of the Aliens franchise what it is involved not just looking at stills from the movie, but also just going and looking at Giger's work and studying his shape language, studying the movement through his items. And that was a very fun challenge, and I highly recommend people do this. I don't think I've included it in this presentation, but one of the things we had to do in class was design a trash can that would fit within Breath of the Wild. And that was challenging. But I definitely suggest that as an exercise to just get your creativity flowing. Next. One moment. I know a lot of people want to get right into doing digital art, and I still recommend having a traditional art foundation for that. But if you are going to try to get into digital art, then I recommend doing long studies. I personally am a fairly slow painter when it comes to doing digital painting. I can go back and forth over something and spend 8 hours one day on it and then hate it, move it all, and start from the place I had started from the day before. And that is not a habit that I can recommend. In fact, that's one I'm trying to break. But regardless of what you're designing, doing anatomy studies like this can be helpful for understanding like the nuance of form, material differences, like the ballerina foot, trying to portray the slight sheerness of the leggings was a challenge. The shift of color in like the veins on the center bottom hand or in the feet in the lower left are all things you need to learn to be able to see and then work to be able to portray. And that's not something you necessarily are going to be able to just do in a few minutes if someone wants some quick designs. But for your sake, doing these kinds of studies helps you become more skilled as a painter, helps you become skilled at observation, which is one of the most important skills as an artist that you can have, and will help you develop the workflow personally that you can then apply to rendering out props, creatures, characters, whatever. Next. So this is a claim from Amora that I have been wanting to do. It's called The Face of the Woods. And long story short, it is a mask made out of the woodland man's face, which is totally hardcore as far as I'm concerned. But it's going to be one of those things where you're not probably going to make it to the scale of the owner's head, because that would be ridiculously large on a person, as you can see in the top photo. But what I've done is I've combined some reference materials for masks. I tried to start with wooden masks, and some of them are like real high-res photographs of actual art pieces. Some are fairly low quality JPEGs of items from other games. Some are handcrafted items that people out in the world have made, and which I find super cool. But most of all, because of the nature of being wooded, I wanted to make sure I had the right reference for the wood. And based on the fact that the cane was gnarled wood, I went with, again, for this, the same kind of tree, which is a bristlecone pine. The most popular one that most people have heard of is referred to as the Methuselah tree, but they grow in these incredible, just swirls and these insanely cool shapes. So I wanted to go ahead and focus on that as the wood material. And I also pulled in like the tips of pine cones just as something maybe a little extra, something that could be a design element. I'm going to try to stream myself working in Photoshop. So hopefully this will work.